I'm recording it to the, yeah. It will be recorded on the Whisk cloud, and so it will be not public. I'm not doing it live, so later I will share it with Melisa or someone else, or Mariel, and then we will be able, you will decide what to do with it next. If you want parts for it about translated, it's up to you.
Okay.
Great. Thanks for doing that.
No problem.
Yes, thank you
Okay.
so much. I believe that we can do it. I apologize for my colleagues, Dulce and Juan Martín, because they can't stay here because they are working too much and they can change their hours. So sorry. And I represent the exposition.
Wonderful.
I will clarify that you're speaking on behalf of the team. I will introduce the entire team and make a point that you will be representing them. Is that okay?
Okay.
So I switch off floor to presenters.
Okay. Hi, everyone. If the members of the roundtable agree, we can wait a couple of more minutes to see if anyone else is logging into the conversation. Yeah, I see some additional people logging in, so it might be a good idea to wait just until maybe 02, 03 the most. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
In the meantime, if anyone wants to introduce themselves in the chat, you're welcome to do it, where you're listening from. Let's engage. It's a great afternoon. I will turn off my WhatsApp so the noise is not heard. Okay. I thought the name sounded familiar. Right. Hi,
Yes.
Joaquin. Hi, Caro.
Hi, Caro. Hi, Anna.
I see we have a very international audience. That's good. Well, it is an international relations symposium, so that's something to expect. But it's always good to know that we are all over the world.
This is great. I really am so admiring of all of you who've organized this. What a feat, really. I'm in awe.
It's quite a big event. Yeah, congratulations. I think, Mariel, you're part of the organization. Is that correct?
Yes, not the conference, only this panel.
That's enough.
That's more than enough. Yes. You're the reason why we are all here today. So thank you.
Yes, of course.
All right. Okay, I think we might get started, and if anyone enters late at the later time and wants to get caught up, they can always ask in the chat. So welcome everybody to this amazing roundtable, as we just said, organized by Mariel here in the World International Studies Committee virtual conference. So within the Feminism, Gender and Queer Perspectives in International Relations track, today our topic will be Feminist Foreign Policy Frameworks and Cases in International Politics. I will start by introducing our roundtable members. We have Cynthia Enloe. She is a research professor at Clark University in Massachusetts. She's the author of several books. The newest is The Big Push, Exposing and Challenging Patriarchy. And the Spanish edition came out last year. I had to Google the name in Spanish so I can supply it to anyone who asks. For her feminist investigations of militarism, Cynthia has been included on the Wall of Honor at the War Crimes Court in The Hague. Welcome, Cynthia. We have also Heather Smith. She's a professor of global and international studies at the University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George, British Columbia, Canada. She's a feminist researcher on Canadian foreign policy. She's also active in the scholarship of teaching and learning, and her most recent work is a co-edited volume with David Hornsby titled Teaching International Relations in an Age of Disruption, fresh off the press, 2021. And we also have our organizer, Mariel Lucero, representing as well Dulce, Chaves, and Juan Martín Barbas. Mariel is a professor at the Universidad Nacional de Cuyo and Universidad Champagnat in Mendoza, Argentina. She's a director of International Relations and Environment Studies Center, CERIMA. She's a member of CoFEI and Red de Politólogas, hashtag No Sin Mujeres. She's a feminist researcher on women's diplomats' participation at foreign policy and armed forces in Latin America. And her most recent work is a chapter about gender politics in Latin America, armed forces, in a collaborative book in press edited by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Sorry for butchering German. I'm very, very sorry for that. And I will also briefly mention her colleagues in her work. Dulce Chaves has a teaching degree in social communication and Bachelor of Social Communication with a major in journalism from the National University of La Plata in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She has a master's degree and PhD in international, and is a PhD in international relations student at the School of Law and Social Sciences of the National University of La Plata. She's the coordinator of the Center for Studies in Gender and International Relations at the University of La Plata. And Juan Martín Barbas has a degree in political science from the University of Buenos Aires. He's currently studying a master's degree in international relations from the University of La Plata and a PhD in social sciences from the National University of General San Martín in Argentina as well. He's a professor of economy at the Faculty of Social Sciences of the University of Buenos Aires, professor of sociology at the Faculty of Economic Sciences of the University of Buenos Aires, and social sciences. So we have a lot of disciplines coming together, a lot of backgrounds in research and practice. So good to have everyone here. So I'll briefly touch on the dynamics of the roundtable. We will start with a couple of questions, and we will give each roundtable member around 5 minutes to answer them. After that first initial couple rounds of questions, we will open discussion for the rest of the roundtable and for questions that might come in from the audience. If you have any questions regarding this, you can already start by writing them here in the chat. If anyone feels more comfortable writing in Spanish, Portuguese, or Italian, I can translate them into English, your questions and comments. So feel free to comment in those languages. Other languages, I'm sorry, but I have yet to learn them. So if we all agree, we can get started, all right? Right, so the first question posed in this roundtable is, how would you each define feminist foreign policy? What elements are essential to talk about it? Is it a useful concept to apply in international relations study? And either you think yes or no, why do you think that is? And maybe we can give the floor to Cynthia to start.
Well, first of all, thank you for everybody who's taking part, and a special thank you for Mariel and Melisa for organizing us, and for those people we can't see in Warsaw who are techies and keeping us alive here. So thank you, first of all, to everybody. And I hope we'll have an open discussion. Feminist foreign policy is a concept that I've now been asked to talk about, you know, maybe for the last year and a half, maybe 2 years, maybe. Ever since Margot Wallström became, for a brief time, she isn't any longer, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden, and introduced feminist foreign policy as a concept she wanted to adopt for Sweden, which has not worked out, but it put it on all our plates, and all of us had to think, well, what does she mean, and what could she mean? And so it's definitely a work in progress, or as I like to think, the clay is still very wet, and that's a perfect time to have the discussion we're having today, I think. When Melisa said that this would be one of the first questions, I really tried to think about it. So this is not final and it's not complete, but here's one of the first things I find myself thinking about. And I wonder what all of you who are tuning in, how you think about it. The first thing is a government, because we're talking about governments now. I mean, we could talk about NGOs having foreign policy, and we should talk about United Nations and other international organizations having a foreign policy. So we should, but at this moment, I'm thinking mainly about sovereign state governments having their own foreign policy. And one of the first things is to have a feminist foreign policy, officials in the name of the state have to take women's lives seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And taking women's lives seriously is something that is rarely done in governments, even governments that have feminists in them, but certainly not in foreign policy, or rarely. So what does it mean to take women's lives seriously? It means that you don't just talk about child soldiers when you mean girl soldiers and boy soldiers, if that's what you're talking about, for instance, in the Central African Republic right now. It means you don't just talk about farmers, you talk about women farmers and men farmers. And I realize that's very binary, and as a feminist, I see both those categories as radically fluid. So I don't think of small categories. One doesn't talk about refugees. One talks about women as refugees and men as refugees. One doesn't talk about immigrants as simply immigrants. One talks about women as immigrants and men as immigrants. One doesn't talk about soldiers or bankers or officials. And one talks about women's lives seriously in the sense that you investigate them, that you take them seriously in all their diversity, And so for me, and I'll end on just this because we want to keep moving along here, but that means that governments, all kinds of governments, have to really be serious about data collection. They have to be serious about disaggregated data about climate change causes and climate change impacts, about displacement in wartime. One has to do gender disaggregated research. If you don't do gender disaggregated research about sea rise, or about immigration, or about displacement, or about investment, in fact, you can't even attempt to have, even a failed attempt, you can't have, of feminist foreign policy. You have to have a basis of evidence in order to make that policy. So while it sounds very techy and probably sounds not as exciting, I mean, who goes out and marches on the street for data collection? But actually gender disaggregated data collecting, which is expensive, is labor intensive, one has to be serious. That is the first step towards a feminist foreign policy, because it shows that you will actually be trying to take diverse women's lives seriously, as if they matter. So that's where I'll just put my oar in to begin with, I think.
Thank you, Cynthia, for that opening statement. Very strong, very, very thoughtful. Heather, if that's okay with you, we'll hear your take on this.
Okay, so my response to what is a feminist foreign policy starts with a lot of hesitation, in part because the language of foreign policy typically in the mainstream sort of sets states up as the external projection of what states do, and then they often black box what is going on inside the state. And certainly in the Canadian context, that's highly problematic. But I think that when we look at some of the feminist foreign policy literature, and again, I'm going to use a Canadian example, the feminist scholars and civil society activists have articulated visions of a feminist foreign policy that I think get around some of those sort of more traditional black boxing of the state issues that arise when we look at feminist foreign policy. So I want to encourage folks to look at the work of the Feminist Foreign Policy Working Group. I'm happy to send this link to anyone. It's a group of civil society activists and feminist scholars in Canada who have written a series of submissions to the Canadian government through Global Affairs Canada that have articulated their vision of a feminist foreign policy, and it's based on very broad consultations with civil society feminist groups. And it was invited, so there are consultation processes that are ongoing. I'm not actually sure what's happening inside foreign affairs in Canada right now. It's a little bit of a black box, speaking of black boxes. But they've articulated a series of principles that I think are really significant and a really good starting point for us to think about what constitutes feminist foreign policy. So the first thing they articulate is coherence. So coherence across areas of traditionally understood foreign policy. So if anyone knows the Canadian case, you'll know it's incredibly incoherent, but also coherence in a way that you have an alignment between traditionally understood international and domestic policies. So that's their way of sort of challenging that false binary that's super problematic, right? So coherence across international policies and from the domestic to the international. They also articulate the language of transformative. And I think this is their way of actually talking about sort of variations of critical feminism, right? So it's not a liberal feminist approach. It's not add women and stir. It is transformative insofar as you understand that your work is about transforming power dynamics and gender inequalities. And it's about gender. It's not just women, right? It's about those radicalizing those binaries. It's also very clear from the critical feminists and the work of the of this working group that it has to be intersectional, so that it it isn't just women, and it is an understanding that power structures and power dynamics have diverse and layered impacts for women, men, girls, Black people, people of color, individuals with disabilities, LGBTQI communities, and so forth, that we have to not think of it as a sort of one-stop shop. As well, a lot of, again, in this working group and in the work of a lot of the Canadian feminists and other feminists, of course, internationally, is that when we think about feminist foreign policy, we have to think about it as decolonizing and anti-racist. And how do we get that into our thinking about who we are in the world and how we project ourselves? In the Canadian context, they also add, and this is significant, that a need that a feminist foreign policy be nonpartisan. And part of their argument there is that it shouldn't rise or fall according to which political party is in government, that it should have in some way be legislated. I think that's an interesting idea because, of course, the various parties will punt one idea to another from one election to the next. They also argue that it needs to be rights-based, promote demilitarization, protection of the environment, sustainable development, and as well, and this links to Cynthia's point about data collection, is that it has to include feminist processes and the promotion of accountability. So it's not just about putting it out there, it's also about how do you build accountable mechanisms. And I actually think I'll leave it there. There was the question of, is it useful for IR, which I think takes us down a very different and complicated path. And I'll just flag, perhaps for conversation, is when we talk about, is feminist foreign policy useful for IR, I would ask the sort of Robert Cox question, for whom? right? For whom and in what context is this concept valuable? And I think then you get the multi-layered responses to that. So I'll leave it there for now and move along.
Thank you very much, Heather, for that incredible intervention as well. And Mariel, now the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, first here we were referring to all the answers to a co-working article in the press about the construction of the term feminist foreign policy, elaborated with Dulce Chaves and Juan Martín Barbas and me. So we think there is no unique interpretation of feminist foreign policy in academia. It arrives in the international relations discipline from the Sweden enunciation of a list of foreign politics in 2014, without any conceptual or epistemological support. So we identify the importance to deconstruct and problematize this term. We consider the term feminist foreign policy as an objective, not a process, not as a process. That is the utopia that guides the way of the government foreign politics, not a reality. It presents a variety of contradictions between settled discourse and practical policies. Therefore, we need to propose and incorporate two new concepts to articulate the theory with empirical work, which allows implementing these values and ideas into policies to apply in a degree scope. In that paper, we consider that a feminist foreign policy theorizes and puts into practice emancipatory actions for vulnerable actors on the global stage, without ignoring the macroeconomic and cultural context in which inequalities and violence are inscribed and that they are trying to eliminate. So we criticize feminist foreign policy, particularly in 4 points. The manipulation of the feminist term, emptying the women's historical fights and converting it functional to masculine hegemonic state and neoliberal economy. Second, for the ambiguity of a definition without determining the type of feminism adopted. It is not the same. It is not the same articulate foreign assistance policy from a feminist decolonial perspective to doing it from a feminist liberal perspective. Third, the scope of the term feminist uses as a synonym of women, which excluded the LGBTQ+ groups. 4, the weak application of intersectionality. And 5, the absence of politics about nonviolence. So we elaborate 2 propositive concepts. First, we propose the term foreign policy with a gender perspective. At this point in the time, the state needs to have developed a domestic gender perspective orientated to reach a gender mainstreaming. This proposition moves forward on issues where the country has expertise in some specific foreign policy with a gender perspective. In the first place, it proposes a domestic development in the matter of gender policies in some national institutions and public administrations area. Second, training in the most relevant institutions to carry out the foreign affairs ministry or chancelleries, where the design and training of diplomats with this perspective and the generation of interaction mechanisms generate inclusive public spaces for discussion with NGOs, civil and grassroots movements in the elaboration of some specific foreign policy issues to give it the necessary intersectionality. By the way, this gender perspective in chancelleries includes an increase in the percentage of women in the highest post and more participation in decision-making positions and other issues. The second proposition term will gradually incorporate the foreign gender policy with a feminist agenda. It includes a dynamic and diverse agenda in its proposal. It is the most advanced foreign public policy in terms of inclusive development and applicability. It would attempt to cover all spheres or issues in foreign policy with a gender perspective built up gradually. That implies a much more fluid interaction with the various domestic actors in matters of gender and intersectionality, with greater participation of grassroots movements, academics, and the constructions of the new efficient permanent interaction mechanisms of internal consult. Here, it is essential to plan the foreign policy with a gender perspective to scope all the areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariel. And this is a very important work because what I gather from all your answers, of course, it's a very critical, as it should be, approach to the use of a terminology that if you overuse it, you might empty it from true meaning instead of reflecting on the practices and the processes and the actors that are involved in building a feminist foreign policy, if such a thing is possible. So within those critical analyses, and more explicitly in what Mariel just said, there's also, you can also interpret the proposals for how to go about it if you want to successfully start paving a way towards a feminist foreign policy. I think you are all being very careful in saying that this is not something that you might say, we don't have it one day and the next day, oh yeah, we've written a document, here it is, here's our policy. It's a road that should be definitely explored gradually and discussed and retraced back and forth. So it's very interesting to hear your perspectives on this. And so if you agree, we can move on to the second question. Of course, if people in the audience are having comments or questions about this first part, please put them in the chat so we can get the discussion going afterwards. But for now, we can move on to the second question that was posed to our roundtable members. In each of your opinions, which is one of the most common and unsuccessful politics applying by self-defined feminist foreign policy governments, let's say? Is the question clear enough? Should I rephrase it? Maybe, okay, let's try to rephrase it. So these governments that have designed and according to their own testimonies are implementing feminist foreign policy strategies, what are experiences that either for them or from your perspective are the most commonly successful or unsuccessful? I guess, what's the easiest way to say that you're applying feminist foreign policy, and what's the hardest way? What are the challenges according to the governments and according to yourselves as well? So in this case, well, Heather, you want to take up the, okay, Cynthia.
Yeah,
Cynthia?
Since it was Margot Wallström that set us on this path in the kind of international sphere, because she actually talked about it as a very prominent person. I think her experience, and I don't know, all of you tell me, and in the chat tell me, has somebody yet, I mean, it's very soon after, so probably somebody's in the middle of doing this research. Does anyone know of somebody who's really tried to track with gritty detail what happened to Margot Wallström's efforts in Sweden as Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Social Democratic Party that is in power in Sweden? If somebody has done that research, and it's probably just the first stage in that research, I would love to hear anybody who's really looked into it. From what I know from my colleagues in Sweden who are in civil society, especially WILP Sweden, that's Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. WILP is the short version of it in English, and who are amongst the main advisors and consultants for Margot Wallström. She definitely worked with civil society feminist groups to try and hammer this out for Sweden. And as many of you probably know, she ran into immediate resistance in the Social Democratic Party that you would think might be one of the most welcoming, or at least the least obviously resistant for their own credibility. But here's where she ran into it. One of her first acts to implement a feminist foreign policy for the state of Sweden was to say that her government, for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, would put a hold on a arms agreement with Saudi Arabia. Now, she picked actually mainly an arms training program. She didn't pick the big weapons sales, which she knew she would get what we'd call flack from. She took a training treaty that Sweden has with Saudi Arabia, because as many of you know, Sweden, while it's not one of the big five of arms traders, in Swedish political economy, jet fighter sales are big. That's from the company that some of us think of as automobiles, but in fact, mainly sells fighter planes. That's Saab, S-A-A-B, one of the biggest corporations in the Swedish economy. And Saab immediately protested Margot Wallström's implementing a feminist foreign policy for Sweden in the form of putting a hold on this training agreement's implementation with Saudi Arabia after the murder of Khashoggi, one of the most outrageous assassinations carried out by the Saudi government, but also because the Saudi government is still one of the main perpetrators of aerial bombing in Yemen, which is in a state of humanitarian crisis. Now, this is really, to me, a really right up front kind of case to investigate. Margot Wallström is no naive. She was a longtime parliamentarian for the Swedish Social Democrats, but she also had been a high-level official inside the United Nations. She knows how international politics work. She, as a member of parliament, was then appointed to be Minister of Foreign Affairs. The head of the party knew full well that she planned to really launch a feminist foreign policy. She spelled out what that meant, and it was about rights and humanitarian aid and development with a gender equity frame and anti-militarism. Those were her pillars. The head of the party knew it. Everybody knew it. But yet when she went to implement it, all of a sudden the resistance went up. Now, here's what's interesting to me in Sweden. And I'm not a specialist on Swedish politics, but if this is happening in Sweden, just imagine any other country you might want to think about. What amongst the resistors to her putting a moratorium, as they called it, on the arms training program with Saudi Arabia, amongst the resistors were not just Saab. Now that maybe wasn't a big surprise, but it was also H&M. And many of you around the world who follow the international politics of gender and the garment trade, which I happen to be really interested in, but I'm sure a lot of you are as well, because the workforce in the international garment trade is about 70% women, about 30% men. H&M is one of the big players. H&M is one of the biggest globalized apparel companies in the world today. And it is a Swedish headquartered company. H&M stood up, the corporate executives stood up and said they supported Saab's resistance. And there was so much because they were afraid that Swedish companies would get a bad name. Not just the arms sellers, the garment making brands. And so there was a back down, not giving up the whole notion of Sweden having a feminist foreign policy, but there was so much flack that Margot Wallström resigned. Again, I don't know enough of the details. She's still in parliament, or at least she was last year. And the person who took her place was another woman who said she too was dedicated to Sweden having a feminist foreign policy. But the resistance was really dramatic, and it wasn't just from the usual suspects, that is Saab. It was also from H&M. And it was not a conservative pro-business party that didn't really support her. So I think it's a very instructive case study to look at as a study of not total failure, but of what resistance will look like, where it will come from. And it reminds me once again, in Heather's good point about the working group in Canada wanting legislative-based foreign policy so that it wouldn't just swing with the pendulums of parties in power, was just a really good reminder to me, because it says, if we're interested in feminist foreign policy as it's enacted, both in a failed form, in a not quite successful form, in maybe rarely and occasionally actual successful form, we have to pay attention and do feminist analyses of political parties. And by the way, of the big players in every country. You have to do a feminist analysis of Saab. You have to do a feminist analysis of H&M. And that's the equivalent of the arms trade companies in Brazil, the arms trade companies in Brussels. And we don't have many studies. There are very few studies of a feminist analysis of the foreign policy operations of any country's biggest companies. But we better do it if we're going to be able to dig into these cases, I think.
Yes, definitely. Oh, wow. I'm going to let other, I'm supposed to be chairing, so I'm not going to make any comments, but definitely some force of thought. Cynthia, thank you so much. Heather, you want to to pick up from where Cynthia left off? Because I'm so hooked into this. Okay.
I know there's just so many directions to go, right? So one thing that's important is to note is that Canada does not have a feminist foreign policy, right? So there was a statement in 2017 from at the time Minister of Global Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, about Canada's feminist foreign policy, but really it was backed up by a feminist international assistance policy, what's called FEAP. And there were signals that somehow national defense was maybe feminist, and maybe there was inclusion of some gender in trade agreements. And so there were hints that here and there that there was this umbrella idea that was working within the federal government. But really the focus has been on the feminist international assistance policy. And technically, it is being worked on now, and the Global Affairs Canada has done all these consultations with feminist groups and should be producing a document, something akin to the Swedish statement on principles of feminist foreign policy. However, there's rumors of a federal election coming up, so I fully expect it to get buried because it got buried in the last election. All references to feminist foreign policy or the feminist agenda got buried in the last federal election, so I actually expect it to get buried in the next federal election, which some people anticipate will be in the fall. So let me just say though, so this question of, you know, what's worked, what hasn't is hard because of course we're all trained to critique. But I have a colleague who, if you haven't read her work on the feminist foreign policy by the name of Rebecca Thiessen, who's at the University of Ottawa, does beautiful, amazing work. Regularly reminds us in our conversations that the fact that there is an articulation of a feminist foreign policy or feminist something related to foreign policy in Canada that had been articulated by a minister, had been supported tangentially by a prime minister, is significant in and of itself, and that there are these feminist insiders who have also been working. There are feminists within the bureaucracies who are trying to push this. And so she often says, so as critical scholars, how do we critique and still support those who are working inside to move this through? So I try to be mindful of that because you know, like Mariel said, there's a long list of problems in the Canadian context. So on the one hand, I think it is important that we had key leaders willing to articulate or engage in a discourse around a feminist foreign policy. I think that's important. I think it gave leverage to feminist scholars, to feminist activists, and I think it provides us a means by which to keep the government accountable, right? So it's better than it not being there. So I think it provides some sort of political leverage points. The problem is that they've done such a terrible job with it that the legitimacy of claims by Justin Trudeau and the current Minister of Foreign Affairs, who's a man by the name of Marc Garneau, claims of anything feminist start to sound really shallow these days. I don't know, I mean, I wouldn't expect you to pay attention to what's going on in Canada, but we've got a massive scandal of hundreds and hundreds of unmarked graves of Indigenous children being discovered in old residential school spaces, right? So that Indigenous elders have told us for decades have been there. And we're talking hundreds of unmarked graves, kids who are taken away from their families. And the Liberal Party's kind of like, la, 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 la. So, you know, they're not really engaging in that. And it's a cultural genocide that Canadians have to deal with. So that kind of undermines, you know, all the kind of human rights articulations and so forth that Canada does internationally. We're also in the midst of massive issues around military misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces that started with the Chief of Defense Staff, and since then has like rolled out to any number of men in leadership positions, and so it's just like they had an interim report where the Canadian Armed Forces were called out for sort of systematic and systemic, you know, sexual misconduct practices. So, you know, it's kind of hard, like there's all these gaps, right? There is no coherence. So how do you have a prime minister or a minister or leaders talk about anything feminist or anything gendered when they don't pay attention to missing and murdered Indigenous women, they deny cultural genocide, and there's a massive scandal around military misconduct. So I think it's important that the language is out there, but it is being so undone by all of these other practices that it makes it meaningless, and it actually becomes a target of right-wing opposition to manipulate in ways, you know, around, so this is feminist, right? So it becomes highly problematic, it becomes weaponized, in fact. So that's sort of a roundabout way of answering your question, but yeah, sort of good, but then, right? So.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, we're posing here, we're opening up more questions than the one that we are attempting to answer. I guess that's the whole point of getting together and discussing a topic that has only a few years behind. So definitely a great input. Mariel, would you like to chip into this conversation?
Okay. Yes. The most successful politics of self-defined feminist foreign policies to convince the public opinion about the good purposes of these politics to women of any condition without changes the patriarchal structures. To elaborate and promote magnificent objectives for women without analyzing domestic policies, resources, and tools to put in practice them, without analyzing women world diversity. The feminist foreign policies proposed by developed countries like Sweden, Canada in part, Norway, Australia, France, and others with a neoliberal perspective. It only shows the women addition to markets through the access to the financial system with credits without the gender lens, and promoting more women's rights, but without supervision about gender justice to apply them. There are no policies with a real impact to promote female autonomies with an intersectional lens. The feminist foreign policy gives the patriarchal colonial aid program package to developing countries' women to explain what they must do. Undoubtedly, these countries repeat the patriarchy patterns with these stereotypes of division roles when women are not taking decisions in a subalternate place when these countries can add the colonial position. There is no mention of nonviolence policies, an eloquent principle for feminism. It is only an unsuccessful politics, but a hypocritical one. The examples of Canada and Sweden, but we can include Spain, Norway, Australia, that are between the first 20 top arms exporters, show that while they assist women in developing countries, at the same time, they export arms to some of these buyer countries. That is the case of Canada with Afghanistan and Bangladesh, or Sweden with the United Arab Emirates, a country with a severe background about violation of women's human rights. And we know the negative effect of conflict on women, not only about their bodies, but on their economy. In the same way, we can mention the most increasing defense budget in the last year in Canada, with a strong structure and engaged defense plan. And Sweden nominated Total Defense 2021 and to 2025 plan, which includes incorporating the double of personnel in armed forces and other high-end equipment acquisitions. That's all.
Thank you, Mariel. Yes, I mean, one theme that continues to come up in this discussion is the level of incoherence between domestic and foreign policies, and the limitations of understanding the international system as a system of certain values that must be protected at all costs, but then those values are applied unequally or are considered differently depending on the context. From one state to another, depending on the relations between one state and the other. So we are all equal, but we are not as equal as it seems. Some are more equal than others, I guess.
Than others, yeah.
There was something, I think, at the end of Cynthia's intervention, I believe, around the fact that as much as we are critiquing these frameworks, it's better to have them than not to have them. I think it was Cynthia who mentioned it. Could have been Heather, sorry. But it reminded me a lot of how a professor of foreign policy of mine used to say, we can critique everything about the United Nations, but let's wonder where will we be without the United Nations, or something along those lines. I guess what I mean to say is, if there's any way to value and rescue feminist principles and how to apply them in a transformative way, that in itself could be valuable and a positive outcome of how we reframe international politics and international relations. Even if it's a constant work in progress, it would seem that having a true feminist foreign policy, if we can consider that term, or gender-based, but a foreign policy with a gender perspective, would be the ultimate goal to achieve, and it's all the work in between that counts, even if we don't achieve perfect scoring in all categories about installing a foreign policy that can be considered feminist. And in that respect, one question that came to mind when I was listening to everybody, it seems like one precondition before thinking seriously about having a foreign policy with these frameworks in mind, a precondition would be the standardization and gathering of information, to this gathering of data to have information in order to make decisions. It would seem, I would like to hear your thoughts on this, because of course it's just my thought. Cynthia, yes, I see you raising your hand.
Yeah, well, just because your question is such a good one, and it was one of the things that I was thinking about. I've learned so much because I'm kind of on the edge of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which has branches in 64 countries, and as a result is constantly being fed the gritty realities of women's lives and the workings of patriarchy, both, which means you have to pay attention to men and boys. And as a result, Wilt really has been my tutor in the last several years, and it's been a wonderful tutorial, a wonderful learning experience, and I'm continuing to learn. And one of the things, Melissa, that I've learned was how the new UN, as you say, UN-based international treaty called the Arms Trade Treaty. When it's broken down to English, it's called the ATT, the Armed Trade Treaty. And it's the first international treaty in the history of humankind, the first international treaty to try and control what are called small arms. Now, if you are faced with a grenade launcher, you don't feel as though you are being faced with a small arm. But when compared to nuclear weapons and to tanks and to fighter planes, rifles, grenades, landmines, pistols, grenade launchers are referred to in the international political arena as small arms, sometimes small arms and light weapons. That's the lingo that people talk who try to control these things. And in between 2010 and 2013, a number of locally based transnational women's civil society groups, including Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and others, tried to have an impact on the Arms Trade Treaty negotiations. Now, this is about learning. One of the things that the women's groups did in Mali, in the Philippines, in Brazil, very particular local women's groups, fed information to the transnational headquarters of these civil society groups operating in the United Nations in New York. So you imagine Malian grassroots women organizers and activists feeding information, just like you said, feeding information about, well, where are guns? Where are guns in any country's society? And it's not going to be the same in Costa Rica as it is in the US, thank God. It's not going to be the same in the US as it is in India. It is not going to be the same. So you have to have on the ground women activists who are trusted by other women to tell you where are the guns. And one of the things the women in Mali educated the activists in New York at the United Nations about was how informed women are. And they said, if you want to know, if you want to control and roll back small arms, again in quotes, in Malian life, then just ask women. Women are intimidated by guns, but they generally know where they are. You go into a village or you go into an urban neighborhood and you ask the women and they'll tell you, they won't control the guns. They won't even be able to touch them and hide the ammunition, although they try. But they will know exactly where the men in their household hide the guns. And if you want to have control over small arms for the sake of, amongst other things, reducing violence against women, particularly fatal violence against women. The thing about guns, as local women activists said, is that once guns are used in domestic violence, the rate of fatality skyrockets. It is awful to be attacked by your male partner with a knife or even with hands, but you are likely to survive. If your male partner or the man in your household attacks you with a gun, you have a much less chance of surviving. And these women said, you have to build into the Arms Trade Treaty these realities. And that was so interesting to me, that that is to create a realistic international treaty, which now has the force of law, although my guess is most of our countries haven't ratified the treaty. It'd be very interesting out of all our governments which ones have ratified the ATT, and what the debate was like, and who resisted, and who pushed it through, and were any local women's groups crucial in the local debate in our own country's parliaments. Were they? I haven't seen the data on that. But what they said is you've got to have a basis in the reality of guns in women's lives, or you will not be able to convince people why it's crucial that the ATT, it's Article 7. I was tutored. See, I try to be a good student, right? I don't learn enough, but every once in a while, a little something sneaks in. It's Article 7 of the ATT, and that was written by feminist, the provisions of Article 7 of the ATT was written by feminist civil society groups based on what they learned from their grassroots activist allies. And I thought that was just a wonderful, by the way, here's what Article 7 says of the ATT. It's a remarkable, it's historic provision, which was resisted mightily, as you can imagine, by some of the usual suspects, including the Vatican, by the way. It says that no government whose companies produce small arms should approve the sale of those small arms to any buying country in which guns are likely to be used in domestic violence against women. The Vatican hated and still hates gender-based violence as a term. They will object to it every time, say my friends who do the lobbying in the UN. But it's amazing to have that provision. It's in the ATT. And it's only because of civil society groups lobbying state representatives, who are the negotiators, but backed by this reality infusion from local women activists who knew where the guns were and how they're used. I'll just use this last example. I was in Portugal, and there was a woman at this small meeting I was at, and at a university in Portugal. And she said, one of the most frightening stories she heard was from a woman in Brazil. She'd been spending time in Brazil and working on violence against women. And one of the women she interviewed said, in my household, the older man in the household never picks up the gun and points it at me. What he does is that during every dinner, he just has the rifle leaning up against the wall near his chair. That's all. That has stuck with me.
That is certainly something to reflect on and to understand how different situations regarding arms use and control and trade are all around the world. And I guess from, well, everything that you've just said is just fascinating. Yes, Heather. But one thing that sticks with me is what a difference it makes when we start considering women, girls, people in diverse collectives as more than numbers of about casualties or statistics when we engage them in the process of policy making at all levels. We are talking about this in gender mainstreaming efforts nationally, but internationally, each instance where this is changed and the perspective changes, the power balance shifts a little bit. I think that's something to consider a small win, but a win nonetheless.
Yeah,
And
let me just add on to that, just to say, that's what I mean about taking women's lives seriously as a basis for a genuinely, even an attempted feminist foreign policy. It means that that woman who told that, not story, that described that reality of the gun sitting in next to her male partner's chair at dinner, she's an expert. She's a foreign policy expert.
Heather, over to you.
Okay. In part, I want to go sort of backwards and forwards, I guess, in thinking about this and this comment about, valuing and rescuing feminist principles, but also links to this question of local groups and the everyday that Cynthia is articulating in her analysis. So now I totally lost my train of thought. My cat, as I'm sure some of this is happening. I have a cat who's now scratching at the door and I'm trying to talk to you. And she's like, of course, it's the only time of day that she does this. But one of the things I think that's important, and it's sort of data related, but it's sort of like, who is our data? How is data gathered? What counts as the examples in which expertise is assessed? So again, noting, I'm a big fan of my friend Rebecca Thiessen's work, but she's got a recent piece with Sheila Rao and Rebecca Thiessen in International Journal, which is the beginning of a large research project, much of which was sort of cut off as a result of COVID, go figure. But what they ask is, what does international assistance do? What does foreign policy do? What does a feminist foreign policy do? And they had a massive amount of money and had teams in various locations around the world that worked with partner organizations who were receiving Canadian international assistance after it had been labeled feminist, right? And asked, did this matter? And the interesting thing, and I think this is also a reminder, as I sit in my air-conditioned apartment about sort of the privilege of my critique, is that what she said is that, they note that, in some instances for partner organizations, it's kind of like, yeah, we'll just check boxes. But for other partner organizations, the fact that there is sort of this feminist gender requirement allowed them to use that as leverage within their own communities, right? So, well, of course, there's ongoing concerns about sort of imperial and universalizing and, the way aid is delivered, et cetera. But there are these points at which, for some organizations, they could use it as leverage points in their own communities to do feminist work that they couldn't otherwise do. And so, they sort of switch the, Thiessen and Rao's work switches the optic for us about, from looking at a policy document to looking at what does it do. And I think that's really powerful. And there are other examples by Canadian scholars who have done essentially that kind of process tracing and have shown that, that it is in that local, it is in that context specific, where in fact you can have some of those small wins, but those small wins sometimes can change people's lives. The other thing that I think it has provided is that I can include it in my course outlines and say, hey, this is government policy, right? So it doesn't, for the more mainstream students, like it has that sniff of legitimacy, which I don't really need to include feminist stuff, but it helps, right? And so I think it gives us a means by which as well to easily introduce questions around feminist theorizing that sort of surprise students. But I think, but the other thing is that because there's this feminist forum, not feminist, this feminist, whatever it is in Canada, is that there's increased demands for an understanding for gender, and their hiring in the Canadian federal government will include more gender analysts. Civil society organizations are looking for more people with gender background. So there is this impact that I think in these sort of places that we don't look. Well, if I quote Cynthia Enloe, the bottom rungs, the margins, those kinds of spaces that we don't look for how politics plays out and how gender plays out. And I think that it problematizes power in ways that we don't think about, right? So I think there are all these hidden locations where feminist foreign policy can have an impact that we don't pay attention to. So, yeah.
Mariel, yes.
Okay. Well, we can conclude. I am talking in the name of my colleagues that it has a good marketing to a state to use violent lens. As we said, we can see diverse countries running to adopt this strategy, feminist foreign policy, but without any real compromise by the governments. That's only because the feminist foreign policy gives them a credible international image. So it is our work as a feminist perspective in international relations scholars to analyze the relationship between the political discourse and political practice, shows the contradictions, and redacts this foreign policy with a more efficient name. That means to exclude the banal use of the word feminism and the use of other categories more proper, like foreign policy with gender perspective or for gender policy with a feminist agenda or other, with a gradual scope to apply gender perspective domestically and externally, and including women in grassroots movements and civil associations in an active construct of international women agenda with an intersectional perspective. That's all.
Yes, definitely. And this actually begs a question that is very current at the moment. Today we had the opening of the Generation Equality Forum, you may have heard of, from now until July the 2nd. And this brings us into an arena where governments are participating, of course, a lot of activists, civil society organizations. You read the language and it's filled with all these hopeful calls for action on intersectionality, on youth. You know, feminism matters more than ever these days. And I wonder, I can already envision your answers, but I want to hear you. I wonder what are your thoughts on how this was supposed to be the Beijing +25 event, right? So how do you envision this platform affecting the government's self-reflections on having or not having a gender framework to think about their policies, both domestic and foreign?
It's really hard to get government officials to reflect on anything.
Good point.
I mean, I don't mean that that is the end of, our thoughts on it, but it is really hard. It's the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And then when they come to write their memoirs, they're in defensive mode and not reflective mode. So I guess the thing is, and this is what both you and Heather and Mariel all said, it's who we're teaching now. I think this really matters. I think the idea now that to have gender analytical skills are considered part of being a skilled public policy civic actor, whether you're in government or not. That's new. Now, a lot of my colleagues would hardly know gender analytical skills if they tripped over it. But a lot of them are quite comfortable now to think that at least our undergraduates, masters, and PhD students, all of them, should acquire those skills from somebody in the program, just not them. And I think that really matters. I think having more and more people taking, and also short courses, special summer courses or special leave retreat kind of courses, as well as formal degree courses that come with gender analytical skill acquisition. I don't think that's a small thing. I think it's really quite impressive. And I know from some of the people that I've talked to who are now in aid agencies or in UN agencies of various sorts, or even in defense ministries as well as foreign ministries that have acquired those skills, they know how to actually introduce questions into policy discussions or into program evaluation assessments that a lot of people 10 years their senior don't know how to do. And that has an effect. So I do think that skill acquisition, which sometimes can be, as we know, shrunken down to just a trinket rather than a skill, but to really push on it and to show how it works and to show what happens if you try to evaluate a program on sea rise amelioration or displacement for sea rise, especially climate change, around climate change policies going forward, to show how what a terrible mistake you can make if you don't have these skills, if you don't know how to apply these kind of gender analytical skills. I think it really does, it makes the discussion sound more serious, always the currency. It makes it more likely that data will be collected and that evaluative criteria will be applied. And I think these are not small things. It also means that all of us have to acquire gender analytical skills, which I'm still learning.
Yeah, I guess I'll follow up. I mean, yes, I too am continually learning, as there's so much, I mean, amazing and rich literature out these days. I just don't know where to begin half the time. But, you know, I think I'm going to sound like such a Canadian here for a minute, but Canadians love to be like everybody's most favorite polite cousin, right? You know, and so we like to, and we generically, the Canadian government typically likes to, you know, like, oh, look at us, we're Canadians, we're good, we're awesome. And so depending on the political party, the Liberals in particular, Justin Trudeau and his ilk, have always valued the United Nations. It's sort of part of, you know, it's part of our DNA, even though we can't get elected to the Security Council anymore because the ruse is up. But there is some data to suggest that the women, peace and security agenda, in particular, the evolution of feminist norms within the United Nations, had an influence on the current Liberal government in terms of its, you know, sort of embracing a feminist international assistance policy and finally a feminist foreign policy. So there is some suggestion that that's there, as well as you know, the impact, for example, of Sweden, right? And this sort of you know, ooh, I want to be like the other middle powers. There's also suggestions, though, in fact, that that there are ministers and the prime minister, who's having a tough time these days, but ministers who generally believe themselves to be feminist, neoliberal perhaps, but feminists. And so in the, you know, few Canadians will sort of say, oh yeah, the UN doesn't matter, because I think it has historically, you know, had an impact and has been used as leverage points by Indigenous peoples, for example, to try and get the Canadian government to act. And so I think as you know, the kinds of international platforms, I think, can potentially have a normative impact. And so I don't want to deny that. And I think it is important. And historically, it's important in Canada, except when they were the Conservative government who didn't care. So it does, you know, it does matter who's at play here. But I think it is significant, and I think that that this, again, but it trickles down into these questions of gender skills and how is it articulated. And one of the things that I've seen, and again, it's these hidden places that we don't look for these impacts. So the Department of National Defense, which of course is a total mess these days, has a ton of money to fund academics. And they just funded a Women, Peace and Security Network project with all these really amazing feminists who are sort of housed in Canadian institutions. How that plays out remains to be seen, but in part, you know, that there's a bit of a push. The other thing that I'm seeing is other colleagues who have massive grants to do, like often military things, are now doing, we need to do inclusivity training, and we need to do this, and we need to do that. And the degree to which it has an impact may be marginal, but it may also have an impact that we can't predetermine. I tend to be a bit cynical about some of these things. I refer to them as the boys in short pants. But I think that there are some, and if we have some of our colleagues who have those moments, I think it can, again, I think it can be transformative. So I think that there's a variety of spaces, and I don't want to be totally cynical, but I think, you know, in the history of Canadian foreign policy, international organizations matter, but I think that the norms in the work of Canadian and international feminists has played out and has impact again in who gets grants, how they get grants, who's invited, who participates, the work that they do. And so again, I think we're going to see it in years, more of it in years to come.
Okay. Well, I feel that there is a different time to see this point. I believe in a long term, and I agree with Cynthia when she said that that there is to learn about the gender perspective. And I believe in education, that it's central to think about a gender society. So, and in a short term, I can talk about Argentina example, because we have Ley Micaela law, and that when the different functionaries in the government need to have some kind of course about gender perspective. And I believe that in our country, because the context is different and the culture is different in different states in the world, so I believe that in our country that was a good policy, sorry. And I believe another thing that is good was Nuna Menos movement. And this movement is grassroots of different movements, women movements. Oh, sorry, sorry, I'm very nervous. A campaign, a lot of changes with the gender perspective in our region. So I believe that it was very good, for example, to create a women minister to accompany changes about gender perspective. So I believe that we need a social change. Maybe a very little the steps to do in the future, but I believe that is a great things in the history of women fights. There was very little steps every day to create and reach to our rights. So I believe that this may be a good measures to do. Sorry, but I'm very nervous.
No, Mariel, that's an excellent point you make. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Argentinian context, when Mariel refers to the Ley Micaela, the Micaela law, that was named after a girl who was murdered by a person who had gotten out of jail because of an order of a judge, even though that person was not deemed ready to get out of prison because of the lack of gender-based perspective of that judge. This law was enacted that states mandatory training in gender perspective for all levels, for the three national branches of government. So the judiciary, legislative, and executive powers at all levels, both hierarchical positions and administrative positions, have to take courses on gender-based perspective and violence against women and girls. This law was mostly, because we have a federal system, subnational governments have to adhere to the law, and I think most, if not all of them, did as well, which basically states the same mandatory training by that subnational government, and so on and so forth for municipalities. So that was a big resonant law, a big resonant step in women and girls' rights. And the Nuna Menos Collective was this huge demonstration that happened pretty much spontaneously after the murder of a 14-year-old girl at the hands of her ex-boyfriend's family, and she was with child. She was 14. And Nuna Menos means not one woman less. And it was a big push in setting the agenda for discussing gender-based violence as it hadn't been before. Then came the changing wording to refer to murders against women and girls as femicides, all this changing terminology and reframing things that were already happening, processes that were already happening. And this gave a huge push for the regional agenda as well in discussing violence against women and girls. So, I mean, it was locally started, but by no means it remained local. Same with abortion. I mean, it's all part of the movement. It's all part of something that has been happening in the last few years in Argentina and regionally as well. And things that happen regionally affect the Argentinian context. And I'm sorry, but I'm also Argentinian and I studied abortion. So that's why I'm already going into this. So I'm going to stop here. I was just trying to give some context to what Mariel was saying. But that is to say that pushing regional agendas and feminist movements pushing for regional agendas is something very significant. It's not minor feat in this context, you know.
Yeah, and I think, Marissa, that it reminds all of us that one should not just think globally and locally, but also regionally. And oftentimes regional change happens because of women's movements learning from other women's movements. You certainly hear about this in Southeast Asia. And that a lot of people who study foreign policy, I'm talking about conventional students of foreign policy, do not really think about social movements. And they do not think how social movements interact with each other. This is certainly true in sub-Saharan African countries. Social movements activists talk to each other, learn from each other. And what you said about the amazing abortion rights law having been won in Argentina is just a wonderful example.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, it comes back to that question of when we look at foreign policy or IR and we black box the state, everything that we lose, right?
Yeah,
all of the stories that we lose, all of the power of the local, right? And like the things that, you know, all the sites that we underestimate power, to quote Cynthia Enloe again, right? Like all of those things that we don't include if we take the mainstream approaches. And the very least, when we think about feminist foreign policy, it starts to pry that open. And it requires that we think about that. Because, you know, there's so many places where they don't fit into categories and schemes and data collection and all of that kind of stuff. Like it's just, you know, it's, I'm just hearing the stories about Argentina, they're just so powerful. And we, you know we have these stories in our various regions and our locales, and just sort of that thought of, you know, never underestimate the work that we do either as academics or as activists. I'm going to tell just a quick story because it seems to fit with, so keep in mind, Canadian Armed Forces in the midst of a terrible sexual misconduct like scandal. It's terrible. So I get an email from this guy who says, you taught me in 1994. So I would have just started teaching at the time. And he's like, and you called me out on something and I didn't like it at the time. And I probably was very angry about it, but I did reflect on it. And that kind of, I don't even know what I called him out on, kind of thinking, I don't even remember, right? But I'm calling, okay. He's like, you called me out on things and you said that I was biased, and I probably called him, you know, I probably didn't call him misogynist, but maybe pushed him a bit back on that. And he said, I still remember that, and it changed my life. And I'm so grateful for this kind of unconscious bias training that you gave me that I didn't really want at the age of whatever, 20. And he says, I now work for the Department of National Defense. And I'm like, oh my God. So then of course it was a private email. So then I Google him and he's like an assistant deputy minister. So he's like right up there, right? Like, I'm like, oh, wow. So this is the thing, right? So from women's movements, grassroots activism to, you know, a conversation in our classroom that may have been deeply uncomfortable. We just don't know sometimes like where the politics play out and where the articulation of feminist principles and feminist analysis can actually impact people's lives, right? And I think it's just really powerful for us to not get locked down into the state, the international, right? And to see how the processes flow in a variety of ways.
Wow.
Yes, definitely. I mean, multi-level politics are definitely more complex, but I guess each framework, and this is something to be said about feminist analysis in foreign policy, as it could be of any of the frameworks that we choose. Every framework is a lens through which to analyze the same events. And each time you apply a framework, you start seeing different things and you start compiling different type of information. And I guess it's not a battle about which is the best framework. It's about complementarity, and it's about building on each other and learning from each other. And that's also very feminist itself, I suppose.
I think, you know, I think becoming feminist in activism and in our intellectual lives just gives us a lot more stamina. We're not as daunted by complexity. I mean, you can't have a feminist curiosity if you can't handle complexity. You might kind of, you know, take a really deep breath and need, you know, 6 other people to, you know, help you answer something at the moment. But we're not daunted by that, because that is the stuff of patriarchy. That's how patriarchy works. It works in complex, multi-layered, multi-sided, intersectional. I mean, patriarchy is also intersectional. I mean, that's how it continues to succeed, you know, ways. And I think it's one of the things that's really when I think of the 2 long years that I spent not having feminist skills, not asking feminist questions, not doing feminist teaching or feminist research. When I think of those, I think those are my naive years. Those are the years before I still started doing real intellectual push-ups. And I do think that trying to think about social movements and the state, trying to think about regions and locales and international processes, it's what we do. Thank God.
Totally. I think we are arriving to the end of our roundtable. We still have a few minutes, even though I said it at the beginning of the conversation. If anyone would like to either write in the chat or unmute themselves to ask a question or make a comment about everything that we've been discussing. Oh, yes, Nancy, please. Oh, it's not.
Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Sorry.
Hi.
I hope you can hear me. I'm on a bus, so I need to wear a mask. Sorry about that.
We hear you perfectly.
Good. Okay. I was just going to say that in addition to the state-centric problem, another issue is this business. I mean, I am all for the scientific method, data gathering, data analysis. We need that. But it's, you know, these stories are so powerful. And yet, if you have to put them into a data set, they don't always fit. And that's another thing I just wanted to put in very quickly. I'll tell you, once I was in Malta and I met an elderly Maltese man, kind of gnarled. He had broken English, but he had said to me, he said, I work in docks during war very bad, too many bombs on Malta. And the gravitas with which he said those simple words, anybody who knows Malta during World War II was pummeled from all sides. And he witnessed that and experienced that. Now, you know, you could interview how many hundreds of Maltese who went through World War II and analyze post-traumatic, you know, post-traumatic syndrome and all of this. And it would be very significant and very effective. But that one story is so powerful. And I think that's another another complexity and another problem. The danger, of course, is, jumping to conclusions. I mean, thank God for the scientific method. Otherwise, we'd be assuming and jumping to conclusions all over the place. It would be horrible. But I struggle with this myself, because there's sometimes a conversation can yield the most powerful insights, but it's not something you can prove the same way. And I thought I'd just throw that out for discussion now or later, whenever. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Any thoughts? Yes, many thoughts. Heather, go.
Yeah, I have many thoughts. I'm not a fan of scientific method. I'm a fan of, making sure I've got my, I can make an argument that has evidence of some variation. But maybe there's some luxury in the Canadian context, because I'm just like, that positive stuff just makes me go, ew. But nonetheless, I think though that there are methods and approaches, we'll use in quotation marks, by amazing feminist scholars that give us the means by which to tell our stories in a variety of ways. Narrative method, feminist standpoint, right? Cynthia Enloe's work, Marisha Zalewski, Elizabeth Dauphiny. There's all sorts of amazing access points to tell stories in really, really interesting and thoughtful ways that don't require us to actually take away the story, right? Of course, there's all the ethical obligations of how we tell the stories and whose stories we tell. But I think that there's lots of room in very diverse methods and lots of wonderful feminist work that shows us that we can ask questions differently, and perhaps enable the telling of those stories. So, and I think that's easy to say as a full professor, right? I also recognize that there are disciplinary implications for folks if they don't follow some sort of, that it can play out differently from one institution to another. But I think there's lots of work to ground really interesting, sort of engaged and alternative to sort of mainstream scientific method approaches.
And one of the things that, just following up with Heather and Nancy's wonderful on the bus, I love it. This is great. I think it's the first time in a Zoom conference there's ever been a question asked from the bus. This is, I don't know, it's got all kinds of analogies that we can deal with. But one of the things that, as any of us gain any more security, now I'm talking about academic in this case, and I realize most people who are teaching on the planet today do not have job security. I realize that. Some of us have a lot more, some of us have even a bit more. That when one has any kind of position, maybe you're a reviewer of an article, maybe you're an external reviewer for somebody who's coming up for promotion, maybe you're on the committee, maybe you're on the department committee, maybe you're on the university committee. You're in some position where you can explain to your fellow faculty members why the person who's doing the work that's being examined is a thoughtful, rigorous, careful, reliable investigator. And sometimes that's the role we play. We can say, no, ethnography has its own rules. Ethnography, as Heather said, have its own ethics. Ethnography is not just anecdotal, which is the write-off that the positives want to use. But it's up to us to learn how to make credible the work of people who are using non-positivist sort of methods. The other thing is that a lot of positive methods are in fact riddled with problems. Just because it's a number doesn't mean it's reliable by any means. But that is one of the things that any of us, and all of us have a little more leverage than we imagine, even if we're way down on the ladder of some hierarchy. Somebody asks us, is this credible? Somebody asks us, can you explain this to me? And I think all of us who have even a tiny bit of credibility and reliability and authority, very small a, not capital, need to use that to explain to our colleagues why the work that somebody else is doing should be taken seriously, even though it's using a method that our colleague is unfamiliar with.
I think definitely we see here the traditionally heated debate around methods in how to do social science research. And again, building on things that were said before, it's not a matter of either or, it's about building on top of each other and finding new and innovative ways to do research and to gather what we can call data that can be used to produce the information. And the word data is already riddled with so many problematic things when we take it as an objective measure of something, which we know from social science that it's not the case. It's very interesting to see so many different methodologies come up. And I guess one of the challenges when thinking about foreign policy is how has foreign policy been traditionally researched on, what methodologies have been used in policy analysis, in international policy analysis, and if different methodologies are being intertwined in other disciplines that are very adjacent: international development, political science, sociology, etc. How do we bring those into foreign policy analysis in order to produce outcomes that can serve the purpose of rethinking foreign policy with a gender perspective, with the gender lens, intersectionality, all these I don't want to say they're all buzzwords, but words that have come up a lot on this table, right? Very, very interesting questions. Does anyone else would like to contribute with a comment or a final question for our roundtable? Yes, no, yes. I have so many, but we only have 10 minutes. Less than 10 minutes. I guess final comments are in order right now. Okay, Ivan. Yes, please. I think you're muted. We can't hear you, Ivan, sorry. It seems that you're unmuted, but for some reason, the audio's no, yeah, it doesn't work. Do you want to write your question or comment? And in the meantime, Claudia can make her comment. Okay, great. Claudia, yes, please.
Can you hear me? Yes, right? Okay. Thank you so much for a wonderful roundtable. I really enjoyed it. A special thanks for Mariel. We participated in a feminist network, Latin American feminist network together. So we have been discussing some of these issues before. So my question is, Cynthia and Heather and also Mariel have been describing all the challenges to implement feminist foreign policy in the context of Sweden and in the context of Canada. But I think in the Latin American context, which this WISC is taking place, this is even harder for so many reasons. There is a great deficit in terms of the representation of women in foreign policy. In Latin America is less than 12% in terms of ambassadors, for example. Well, there is in general like a democratic deficit in terms of foreign policy. So my question is, do you, and maybe this is more for Mariela for that, do you think it's better to just drop off this concept of feminist foreign policy because it really, it entails so much that it will be difficult to channel it in the foreign policy process, and we should keep maybe a more restricted concept of gender equality, or we just keep going for the big thing, this notion of feminist foreign policy that entails, as you described very well, much more. So what do you think it is best in terms of policy, not in terms of scholarship? And thank you so much again.
Mariel, come on, tell us.
Well, I believe that I'm not accept the foreign feminist foreign policy. Do you know that? No. Well, I believe that it's possible to give some gradually to implement a feminist perspective. Gender perspective in foreign policy, and I believe that first of all it's necessary to begin at the domestic with domestic politics. But it is not necessary to have in all areas and development of these politics. I believe that it is possible to have a plan to think about the future, to implement, continue with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, and think about specific issues where this country have some issues where this country could afford some gender perspective. For example, in my country, there is in human rights. So, well, this is one of the points. In your case, is in Chile is commercial. In the commercial area, you have a chapter included in some treaties, and I believe that maybe in some places, I believe that there is necessary to have a credibility about this gender perspective. So I prefer to have some plan and reach to this point, and then identify some issues when the gender perspective have a background. So I believe that it could be the better or more effective way to arrive to this kind of politics. I believe that I respond your question, Claudia.
Yes, we have been discussing about this before, that maybe something gradual in the Latin American context makes more sense in order to have, you know, this really big, great notion of feminist foreign policy that we're not going to even come close to it, that I cannot even think about include these issues, for example, about race in the current context of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's just unthinkable. I'm not trying to be pessimistic, it's just the reality of how conservative the foreign ministries in Latin America are today. But yes, we have been, I'm just concerned about which is the best strategy, because Mariel has been able to convince me over time, but sometimes I think, you know, it's just, let's go all in and it's better, and then we'll see what happens. But yeah, so this is why I keep asking.
The other point is about in our region is it's about the indigenous issues. So the intersectionality is impossible when you don't think about what happened at in domestic policies, and you could propose and foreign policy with a gender perspective, but without intersectionality to the world. So it's very incoherent, like Heather says. That's all.
Great. And okay, we are definitely approaching the closing of the roundtable. Do you want Evan to try one more time to see if you can unmute and speak? Otherwise, I can read your comment if you don't mind. Okay, I will make the question. I will leave the comment for Cynthia. It's mostly about his experience with you as a teacher, Cynthia. So it's very, very nice, actually. So he's asking about the teaching in the IR field, still treating topics like gender in a specific way, confined to a specific course or a lecture. And I guess it's an interesting topic to raise for our final reflections. We are talking here, we are discussing how future generations, both in academia and outside of academia, are entering into the IR field. What are your recommendations coming from the academic world, but being in touch with policy as well, in terms of mainstreaming gender and feminist approaches into the teaching of IR and foreign policy? Do we want it? Do we not want it? How do we go about it if we think it's a good thing? I'm interested in hearing.
I think sometimes, and hi, Evan. Hi, thanks for your really good comment there. I'm glad you're a teacher now. That's the good news. But I think that in our work today, we have to constantly listen to people who are trying to have an impact on foreign policy in their own countries and find out, what do they run into? What kind of language do they find turns off people that they're lobbying, or people who are colleagues in the foreign ministry or in the defense ministry or in the commerce ministry? What is the kind of language that all of a sudden they think, oh my God, they're listening to me? And oftentimes it is interviews with us doing the interviews, or sometimes it's a journalist having an interview with, to talk about people who are in the policy mix, which I'm not. And to hear what it's like. When I say in the policy mix, I mean in civil society groups that are lobbying or who are themselves officials and speaking off the record about what it is like. And I think that really is very helpful. And it also means we can bring that to students and say, here's what people who try to introduce gender analysis into their own policy setting, here's what they run into, or here's what really seemed to catch people by surprise and actually open them up to a kind of understanding that they never had before. And I think that is I get it sometimes from really good journalism, or I get it from colleagues of mine who interview people who have recently retired and therefore can be more candid from policy positions. And I think it's very helpful. They, of course, are gendered, whether they be non-binary or identify as men or identify as women. Somebody in policy, there's no such thing as a policy official or a policy maker. Everybody is gendered all the time. And that will play into the kind of reception they get and their own reflecting on it.
Wow, what a closing statement, Cynthia. Thank you so much.
Not a
Heather, would you like to?
We're just
it's an opening. Actually, it's a statement for further discussion. It's very everything that's been said on this table is very provocative, very thought-provoking. So thank you for that. Heather, would you like to add to this?
No, I think that all gendered all the time is the perfect end to this conversation. I just take 30 seconds and thank Mariel for the invitation to this. I have learned so much. I am so grateful to have been here today. Your work sounds so amazing. I hope that we see it soon. I can read a bit of Spanish, but it's been so amazing and the questions have been so great. So I'm so grateful. So gracias a todos. So, and yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Mariel, do you want to close us up? Because you were the instigator of this meeting. So please do the honor.
No, I am very very happy with this roundtable, and I can say thank you for everyone to listen this conversation, and it was very, very comfortable for me with this both exposes and to change our opinions and listen the others. So thank you so much. And thank you, Melisa. Thank you, Melisa. Please.
Please, you're welcome. I learned so much today. I'm leaving, and I guess we all are, with more questions and ideas than what we came here with. So that's a big win. So let's continue this conversation in our social media channels, or let's try to not make it stop here. And thank you all for coming and staying. And I think this marks the end of the panel. So roundtable, sorry. So thank you, everybody. Big round of applause for our roundtable members. Excellent. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Karina. Wonderful connection.
Welcome. Hope to see you all next year in Buenos.
I'm getting my ticket.
Yes,
I have so many canceled tickets for Buenos Aires. I'm already planning on going next year like 10 times. I don't live in Buenos Aires. Hi, Cuyo.
Thank you, Melisa.
Goodbye. Great, it was a great panel. Great to listen to you.
It was so great. So I am signing off.
Bye.